Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to our community meeting. We're looking forward to presenting a high-level overview of the contents of the draft element and then talk specifically about some of the programs. And so I'm going to turn it over to our consultant, Dan Weary from Michael Baker International. Thanks, Dan.
Great. Thanks, Cindy. Good evening, everybody. I'm Dan Weary from Michael Baker International. It's been our pleasure to work with the City of Gilroy on the preparation of their sixth cycle housing element update, which is the subject of our meeting tonight. We've had a couple of community meetings already, community workshops. This one is focused particularly on the public review draft, which has been out since September 12th and is available for comment. So we're taking comments. We've been receiving comments. So this is an opportunity for us to give a kind of an overview and then also discuss particularly the programs component of the housing element tonight to make sure you know what is kind of the bottom line for this plan. And then we can take any questions or comments that you may have. I will note that comments can occur. So our official comment period on the draft ends on October 12th. That's a 30-day period. We can continue to include comments after that point, all the way through adoption, which will be into early next year. However, any comments that are received by October 12th will be specifically reviewed and considered in a revised draft that we're going to prepare and submit for the State Housing and Community Development, or HCD, department review, and they'll have 90 days to review this revised draft. So that will occur between roughly late October through late December, early January. So overall, I've got about 20 or so slides, so 20, 30-minute presentation, and then we've got time for Q&A for you. So real quick, I'll get my clicker working. There we go. So this is our sixth cycle housing element. They're 8-year periods or cycles. So this next period begins on January 31st, 2023, and we'll go through January 31st, 2031. So that's why we call it the 2023-2031 housing element. We've been working on it for most of the year now, and it includes 6 main chapters. You see here at the top: review of accomplishments, looks at our old housing element plan. We evaluate that and then carry that forward and make revisions. And that's all the plans and programs. It has a housing needs assessment, has a lot of socioeconomic data in there, all sorts of different ways to look at our housing needs, lots of tables and charts. We have a section on affirmatively furthering fair housing. So that's just making sure that housing is accessible and fair for all people. So housing for everyone. And then we have constraints on housing review, and we look at primarily regulatory constraints, things that the city can control. So we look at the zoning and the process. That's a big focus on that chapter, what we can do to streamline that process and make it easier, less expensive, and more certain. We've got a chapter called Housing Sites and Resources, and that identifies one of the main requirements of the housing element is to identify adequate sites that can be developed over the next 8 years to meet our specific housing unit allocation from the state. And I'll get into that a little bit later, but we need to build a certain number of homes over the next 8 years, and that's determined by a bunch of formulas, and that gets allocated to every city and county in the state. So everybody's got a number they need to meet over the next 8 years. And so part of this is to make sure that we identify sites that are suitable and appropriate for development. They've got the right zoning, the right land use, the right conditions to be developed. And then last but not least, the last chapter is the housing plan, which includes our goals, our policies, and our programs. So we take all those prior chapters and kind of wrap them up and figure out, okay, how are we actually going to get this done? What are we going to do? And so this is what we'll really be focusing on tonight. And then there's several appendices to the housing element. And that includes the sites inventory map and a list. So that shows the 45 or 46 sites that we've identified on the map. And then there's a section on the community outreach and engagement to date. So we've got a summary of that and including our online survey. So with that, I will move ahead. And again, we're going to be focusing primarily on our housing goals. And what we've got here, the goals are broken down into 6 main sections. And here they are here. We have housing production, removal of governmental constraints, preservation and rehabilitation, making sure that the houses we have, whether they're market rate or below market rate, remain sound and safe and sanitary condition for as long as possible. We want to maintain our inventory. The 4th goal is to housing assistance to meet the needs of all income levels. So again, we encourage and support the provision of a variety of housing types primarily, and then there's different programs designed to provide assistance for certain special needs populations. And that's the next section, special housing needs. So this is making sure that our housing is available and appropriate and accessible to all household types, or all types of persons. And then our 6th goal is about fair housing, and that's to ensure equal opportunity for residents regardless of race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, etc. Everybody gets equal access to housing. And then finally, we have a whole goal, and there'll be a variety of programs and actions related to each one of these. And the last one is education and outreach. And that's just making sure everybody's aware of what our programs are, what we intend to do, what resources are available. And then there's a variety of programs to kind of make sure that the message is getting out and the information is available. So with that, we can get into it. So I've got a series of slides here that will go through those 7 categories. So you can kind of see these are the actual programs. So there's the first one that we mentioned, that first goal was housing production. So under housing production, we have 12 programs to help produce more housing and the housing types that we need. And so we just kind of list them out here. I'm not going to go through all of them. It's a lot of words, but this is kind of a quick overview. It kind of shows you the emphasis, shows you the range of different programs that we have. And then after I go through these, we've got some excerpts, and there's about 49 different programs here out of the 7 categories. And we're going to highlight about 12 of those that we thought would probably be of most interest to you, but we can go back and talk about any of these at any point. So I just kind of want to give you the overview and see everything that's in here. So again, we've got these different 12 here. And then when we talk about removal of government constraints, we've got these B1 through B7. So we've got a number of different programs there. As I mentioned in our prior presentations, Gilroy's done very well on their housing production, including producing a lot of lower income units. And so we didn't see a ton of constraints, but there's always things that we can do to kind of tweak and improve and streamline the process. So we've got a number of different recommendations there. And then the 3rd category here is housing preservation and rehab. And you can see there's 6 programs there. I'll note a couple here, like monitoring of at-risk units. That's a term that we use. That's really any particularly below market rate unit or affordable housing unit of any kind that's at risk of converting to market rate. So typically they're there for a period of time. They make a commitment that this will be below market rate for a number of years. Usually it used to be 35 years, it's done 55 years, now it's 99 years. So we try to keep them below market rate as long as possible. But then we look at housing rehab, code enforcement, kind of tenant protections, some of these last ones in here. So we can get into any of these that you'd like. Housing assistance to meet the needs of all income levels. This is our kind of 4th category here. And there's just a number of different programs that the city participates with the county and other agencies and organizations that collectively provide assistance for a variety of housing needs, and particularly construction of affordable housing. And then the 5th category is special housing needs. And again, you see 9 programs here. The last one I'll note was one that came up as a result of our last workshop, which was August 29th. It was on a Monday with the joint City Council and Planning Commission. And that was providing priority for any of the special housing that gets built, particularly for Gilroy residents or people who work in Gilroy. And so that's kind of a new program that was added just in the last few weeks. And the last two here are fair housing. As I mentioned, we've got a number of different programs there most of these are continuation of existing programs, and they carry over. And then education and outreach is our last one. And that's, again, making sure that all of this information is available to the public, that we're taking actions to make sure that people have the resources and access to the information so they can make good decisions. So there's a number of different programs for that. So that's my quick overview. And then we've got a number of slides that goes through kind of a selection of each of those 7 categories. So the first one's here, and I'll kind of go over the titles and maybe briefly describe them. And again, if anybody's got any questions, we can come back and ask questions. But A3 is an interesting one. This is actually required by recent state housing law changes. And it basically says any projects that include housing that's affordable to households that are lower income, so that would be below 80% of the area median income. If you've got 20% of those units reserved for those lower income households, then the city has to, and this would be all cities, has to approve those by right. That means they don't go through the normal discretionary process where they'd be subject to a public hearing and going through planning commission or possibly even city council. So they basically, it's like getting a building permit. If you meet your requirements based on objective data, you check that list off and you go get your building permit, your grading permit, and you can start building. So the key is it still gets reviewed. It's still subject to approval, but it'll be subject to purely objective standards. And it's not subject to any discretion, really. So that's an interesting project, and that will be applicable to any projects that are not so much relevant here in Gilroy, but if we had to rezone to meet our lower income RHNA, which is our regional housing needs assessment, that's that magic number that we have to meet. And we have numbers for very low, low, moderate, and above moderate. And if we had to rezone to make sure that we had enough sites and capacity to meet our lower income units, those rezone sites would be subject to this section. Any sites that are reused from a prior housing element, and there's some caveats and fine notes there, but generally if it's reused or rezoned, again, to meet those lower income units, it's subject to this provision. So it's a new requirement. We'll put it in place and it may or may not be used. Let me go back one. The neighborhood district policy. This one is being revised. It's limited in application. One of the key aspects there is that it requires effectively an inclusionary housing requirement. And if you don't build below market rate units, then you pay an in lieu fee. And that's going to be kind of changed so that this would be generally more applicable to other areas of the city. So there's going to be a study that's required because if we include these extra fees and these requirements or these requirements to build the housing, that could be a constraint on development. You know, if developers say, gee, I just can't afford that, I'm going to go elsewhere, then nothing gets built in the city. So there needs to be a study before that gets implemented. So that will be studied, and based on the study, it could be implemented. These are all the A programs are production related. So this is all about how to encourage and promote development of housing of different types. So one is ADUs, or accessory dwelling units. And this program would include model plans or pre-approved construction drawings. And that can save any applicants a lot of money in terms if they want to build an accessory dwelling unit. So it's an incentive. It removes a cost. And there's a couple of different plans underway where we might be able to kind of share in a marketplace and have lots of different types of models that are pre-approved, and then applicants can select from those based on what fits their ideas of what they'd like on their property. The next one is a nice one that the city proposed. It's to facilitate missing middle income housing. And that's generally kind of single family size homes, but it might include like duplexes or triplexes, fourplexes. And the idea here is that in certain areas, these would be allowed, quote unquote, by right or ministerially, like we talked about with the lower income housing, provided they meet with objective design standards. So that's the key term for that, is to have these objective design standards. And we'll hear that over and over again. That's also a requirement, some of the new requirements from state law. Inclusionary housing policy. So like that neighborhood development plan, this is now kind of the corollary. So this would be inclusionary zoning feasibility study, and if it proves that it's possible to do this without significantly or unnecessarily reducing overall housing production, then it could be implemented to expand more citywide. There's density bonus requirements currently under state law, and there's a possibility that in order to encourage particular housing needs, that the city could provide additional bonuses beyond the minimums required by the state. So right now, the maximum bonus you can get, and it's kind of a sliding scale, is up to 50%. But again, some cities are going higher. They would allow, for example, more than one accessory dwelling unit on a property, provided in some cases that that extra one is affordable. Or you could have higher density bonuses on the number of units you can build on a particular site, and that would generally afford or offset the production of more affordable housing or below market rate housing. B2 is zoning and general plan densities. Generally, we're going to look to implement the newly adopted general plan, which was adopted in 2020. And the general plan talks about bumping up those density ranges a little bit. So in the R3 designation or the appropriate zones, the maximum would go from 16 dwelling units per acre to 20 dwelling units per acre. And in other areas, it would go from I think it's 24 to 30. And in some cases, there's no upper limit. So that's something that we're looking to do. So those are things that are already being considered under your general plan. Housing elements, part of that general plan, but it's acknowledging that there will be some zoning changes coming to implement that, and it's being reflected here as well. So permit streamlining, we're always looking for ways that we can create a more streamlined, a more efficient process. And one way is to permit things, as I mentioned, by right or ministerially. That means it's just subject to objective development standards or design standards. It doesn't go through the longer review process. Again, if there's other ways that we can clarify the process, sometimes it's just information so people understand it. Sometimes that's putting information up on the website so people really know, hey, these are the steps. I know I can understand the expectations, the timing. That's all part of streamlining as well. Let's see, objective design standards. I said you'd hear more about that. So again, sometimes there's standards that include a lot of vague language, and we want to take those out and provide things that an applicant can look at and say, oh, okay, if I do this, this, and this, A, B, C, and D, I'm going to get approval, or I'm going to be consistent with what the city wants, as opposed to things that are purely subjective. It's compatible, or it looks similar to. That's in somebody's judgment. So we try to replace terms like that with more objective data. Last one here is incentivize micro units. So one thing is that when we talk about density, most codes, most cities consider all dwelling units the same. A dwelling unit's a dwelling unit is a dwelling unit. And to a certain extent, that's true. but not all dwelling units have the same impacts. And so, one thing is to acknowledge that there's different types of dwelling units. And generally, the smaller the unit, the smaller the population, the fewer traffic, the less water consumption, less energy demand, less children and school children. So often, sometimes those are overlooked and not allowed in the codes. So here's the idea to specifically revise the code to establish standards for small units, which are becoming more and more popular. And they're more naturally affordable. So we're going to try and remove any barriers, make sure that they're specifically allowed. And then one thing we can do, particularly for like senior housing, similarly, they don't have the same impacts. They don't drive as much. They don't have as many cars. So we can reduce parking standards for senior housing. And that eliminates or minimizes a significant cost for all development. Parking eats up a lot of land and a lot of resources. And often it just has a car, taking up all that space and it's not actively being used. So in this case, for seniors where we know the standards are reduced, there should be standards that reflect that. So the plan is here to modify the zoning ordinance to have reduced standards for senior housing. And as I mentioned before, the priority for Gilroy residents, and this would be residents and or individuals working within the city of Gilroy, would basically get the priority for any of the affordable housing units that become available or are built. So again, you put a lot of resources into this and you're trying to take care of your residents first. And that's what this would do. And so those were the programs that we were highlighting. The ones I didn't mention were again, about education and outreach. And so we've got a number of projects in there and programs that make sure that we're currently updating all the relevant information, providing good, useful tools and resources on the website, promoting resources, making them available at community events, doing annual distributions to people so that they're aware of rights and responsibilities as either a tenant or a landlord, et cetera. So with that, that's kind of my presentation. I'll just share where we are in our next steps. Like, as I mentioned at the beginning, the public review draft was published on, I think it was Monday, the 12th of September. The 30-day public review period is going to go through October 12th. And again, as I mentioned, you can continue to comment, but that's kind of our cutoff period. We're going to review all those comments received within that 30-day period, and we'll make appropriate revisions to the draft housing element and then submit that to HCD. HCD then has up to 90 days to review that and give us comments. They give everybody comments that require more revisions. So there'll be another round of revisions after the HCD comments come back. And the idea is that we'd have just enough time to get those comments in and possibly get this adopted in January. That's kind of there's a deadline for January, and we can move beyond that, but that's a goal we're trying to meet. So that's our current plan, and I'm available to answer any questions you may have or take any comments that you've got. And I will remind you that this is being recorded, and this recording will be available, as well as this PowerPoint will be available on the city's website, like our other workshops and presentations. So if you or anybody you know wants to review this again at the comfort of your own speed, you can go back and listen and listen to that again, take advantage of that opportunity. And again, sometimes that helps you if you want to submit comments. You said something, I want to follow back up on it. So it's there for your use. So that'll be up in usually just a couple of days after this meeting closes tonight. So thanks. I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, so with that, we'd invite you, if you do have a question, you can raise your hand, or we do have the Q&A module open, so you're more than welcome to type in a question, and we'll see if we can answer it.
Yeah, and I will say it's helpful if you type them in, because that becomes part of the record, and then they're, it's nicely recorded, and we can include that in our overall project summary, and we can remember it. We don't have to transcribe them later. So written comments are great. I see we've got about 10 attendees that have stuck with us. So thanks you guys for your interest in this. And
All right, it looks like, Dan, that we have a couple of hands raised. So
okay.
probably not going to say this name correctly, but Paria, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation.
You're welcome.
So these are all very exciting things. I was just wondering if there is any plans or projection regarding developing more kind of a mixed-use building in downtown area, the areas that is undeveloped. I didn't see anything regarding that on the presentation, or I missed it. Sorry about that.
Yeah, and yeah, thank you for your question. It's a good one. The short answer is yes. This was kind of a limited presentation on the programs, but there are a number of sites in downtown that are currently zoned and planned for mixed use, commercial and residential. We're not changing the zoning. We're not changing the general plan. We don't need to. We have plenty of existing sites, but there are that is part of the downtown area plan. There is a specific plan. I think there's some plan in the future to update that downtown specific plan. I don't think it would change it dramatically necessarily, but it would probably enhance and improve upon the existing programs. But yes, mixed use is encouraged and promoted. It's possible that some of the zoning amendments that are, when they're made to comply with the general plan and or comply with the objective development standards, could be updated as well to kind of enhance those zoning requirements to kind of, again, facilitate mixed use development. That's a good question.
All right, and then we have another question from Richard Oliver. Richard, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself.
I'm Dick Oliver with Dividend Homes. I appreciate the presentation, Dan. I have been working for many, many years on an annexation on a small, about 50 acres in Gilroy. And I wondered, is it appropriate to have in the study that you're doing some provision to think about streamlining the process after it happens, it gets annexed, to go from annexation to all the next steps until you can start developing the property, to streamline that process so it doesn't take another 3 years to go through a specific plan, a new environmental study, a new general plan, and have to amend the general plan. Is there any streamlining that you can do to maybe speed up that process if we should be fortunate enough to get the LAFCO approval?
Yeah, really good question. The housing element only deals with the city proper now, but obviously, you know, these city boundaries are subject to change. I'm glad you're working on that. There's, I can't say there's a program that we could put in the housing element that would streamline that, because there's pretty rigid statutory requirements that you have to go through, and you just listed, I think, most of them. You know, it's possible now that with the update to the general plan, this is probably a good time to do it, because you might be able to kind of, quote unquote, tear off of the environmental review that was done for the general plan. That might save you some time. That's one of the things that typically takes a long time, as well as, you know, looking at the extension of services, et cetera. So I think your timing is probably pretty good to do it as efficiently as possible, but I'm not sure there's any obvious step that we could make to streamline that anymore, because it's a pretty rigid process, unfortunately.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right. And then we do have a question that was typed in from Keith Diggs. He's asked, if there's a program to facilitate missing middle housing, why aren't missing middle standards proposed for the entire city? Is there any reason other than prioritizing how homes look over how much homes cost?
Okay, a couple parts to that question. I'll try to answer them all. So why aren't missing middle standards proposed for the entire city? You we've got some districts that would probably already allow missing middle already. So I think the idea is to in fact, we do have, I think it's the R2 zone currently allows duplexes, triplexes, I think quadplexes too. I'm looking for Cindy's head to nod.
Yeah, they're distributed across the R2, R3, and R4.
Okay, good. So they are allowed. The idea is that the process would be streamlined to make it easier and quicker and cheaper to do it. So it probably will apply to all of the zones where they're currently allowed. So hopefully that's the first part. And then the other part is, are there any reason other than prioritizing how homes look over how much homes cost? Any reason? I'm not sure I understand the question, but they're not just how they look, but it is a good way. And many of these, in fact, I've got some extra slides. Many of these look like older homes, or older homes can be converted into multiple units. And sometimes you don't really notice it unless you kind of notice, gee, it's got 3 or 4 utility meters on the side of the house, or sometimes it's got more than one address number on it. So it's a good way to do it and kind of fit into the community with, really minor impacts or modest impact.
Dan, can you pull up the slides of the different?
Yeah, these were.
So the idea behind the objective design standards, yeah, it does have somewhat to do with how something looks, because if you look at these images of fourplexes and multiplexes, or even less density than that, in some cases they look just like a big single family home, and so they don't have so much disruption, at least aesthetically, on the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are some examples that I took recently on a walk. And so most of these, I think all of these here are fourplexes. So they're you can kind of see 4 square homes. So there's probably two on the ground level, 2 on the upper level, but attractive looking homes.
Hey, Dan, it looks like Keith has raised his hand, so I'm going to go ahead and ask
Yeah,
him to
follow up, because I'm not sure I answered this question properly. So thanks, Keith.
Yeah, sure. Hi, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. I work for Uni Law. I'm not trying to play gotcha, but truth is, I'm a 34-year-old attorney, and I'm living in a shed because I got priced out of Phoenix, Arizona. So the housing crisis is national in scope. California plays a part. It's not necessarily any one city's fault, but we know that the problem is that we have predominantly single-family zoning across large parts of most every city. So the question is, I understand what missing middle housing looks like. Why not just allow it everywhere? I'm asking a lot of cities this, and I have yet to have one city just respond and say, oh, we might look into that. And that's really what I'm looking to see happen somewhere. And I'll work with a city that's willing to do that.
Okay. Yeah, and I think some are. I know there's been a push to do that and try to fit these into single family zones. So it'd be like an R1 zone typically is your lowest density, or one of the lower density single family residential. So again, I think as Cindy mentioned, it's currently allowed in the R2, R3, R4, and obviously then we've got higher density and mixed use zones. So it's almost everywhere. But that's something that the city could certainly consider. And it's to kind of, the other thing that is happening is the SB 9 allows lot splits and ADUs, which has a similar effect. But I think you could argue that allowing the duplex, triplex, or quadplexes in a way could be comparable to and maybe have certain advantages over an SB 9 lot split and ADU. I think there's a number of different applications. So I think it's one way to do it.
Keith, I'll put my email in the chat, and you're welcome to send me anything you have. We can take a look at it. So I'll put my email in the chat.
So Cindy, I don't know that we have a chat open that you could put that email in. So maybe if you just read your email out, and then Keith can maybe make note of that and write it down.
Sure, and it's on our website also. So it's my first name, Cindy. And you can see my name on the screen, Cindy.McCormick, and it's spelled out there, at cityofgilroy.org.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't put that into the presentation. I'm gonna put that up there.
And Rochelle, what's the that short URL for the housing element update? It's
gilroy.city/HEU.
great, thanks.
All right, and with that, I don't see any other questions that we have open right now. So if you do still have a question, please raise your hand. And I don't see any additional hands raised.
Yeah. Good. We've had a lot of these workshops recently, so people might have a little workshop fatigue. Hopefully we've given you the answers you're looking for, and maybe you've heard them before. So that's good. I will note that we do have, go back, the next workshop is going to be on Monday, the 17th, and that's the City Council hearing, I believe, or workshop. And then
so it'll actually be part of the City Council agenda. So it'll be, the agenda will be posted at least the Friday before the meeting, so you can see where it falls on the agenda. And so both the October 17th council meeting and the October 20th Planning Commission meetings will be in person here at City Hall at 6 o'clock.
All right, and it looks like we did get one more question. So Adriana, I'm going to ask you to.
Did she lower her hand? Is she still here?
Oh, she did lower her hand.
Heard her hand.
I guess we don't.
Maybe she was asking about the next meeting. So, oh, here we go. Are there plans for affordable housing for disabled? I wouldn't say there's a specific proposal that I'm aware of, at least, but there are programs to make sure that we're providing reasonable accommodations for anybody with disabilities or any special needs, and it's kind of a full range of special needs. So the answer is that there will be programs to make sure that those are considered, and there could be incentives, for instance, that come out to provide those things. I know, just kind of thinking off, and this is not anything in the current program, but sometimes where there's large tract developers, some cities have required large tract developers to have a universal design ready, so that it's a prepackaged option, and so that's available from the different types of housing options that you might be able to select from. So that's just something that can be done. But
yeah, in fact, in the Glen Loma Ranch BMR apartments, they are accessible units.
Oh, good.
All right, and with that, I don't see any more questions. Cindy, if you're ready, I think we can go ahead and close out the meeting.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Feel free to contact me with any questions that you have, or any comments, or any recommendations.
All right, thank you. Have a good evening.
Great. Good night, everybody.